Well, they had a lot of problems at that time, with a lot of crime and stuff. And that's one of the reasons that I was able to keep my kids at home. I know Michael always complained, but he never did have a childhood. He had a wonderful childhood. Why I say that? Because his childhood, he was there with his brothers and sisters. He always played with them. I just didn't want him out there playing with the kids and stuff that always in the truck.
There is a photograph that circulates every few years online, and it always gets the same reaction. It shows a small boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, mid-spin under stage lights, arms flung wide, a smile stretched so big it looks like it might hurt. People share it with captions about joy, about talent, about a star being born. Almost nobody asks the question that actually matters. What was happening to that boy in the hours before the photograph was taken, and what was waiting for him the moment the lights went down? Because behind nearly every early performance Michael Jackson ever gave, there was a man watching from the wings who was not applauding. He was grading. And if the performance did not meet his standard, the consequences did not wait until morning. This is the story of Joe Jackson, the man who built one of the most successful family acts in the history of American music, and the son who spent the rest of his life trying to figure out whether he had been raised or engineered. It is a story that has been told in fragments for decades, in talk show clips and tabloid headlines, but rarely put together in full, because the full picture is uncomfortable in a way that resists easy packaging. It does not fit neatly into either the story of a ruthless villain or the story of a misunderstood disciplinarian. It sits somewhere in between, in a place most families never have to examine so publicly, and that in-between space is exactly where the real damage lived. To understand how a 9-year-old ended up carrying the weight of an entire family's future on his shoulders, you have to go back further than the fame, further than Motown, back to a steel town in Indiana, where a man, with unfinished dreams of his own, decided his children would finish them for him. Gary, Indiana, in the 1960s was not an easy place to raise 5 sons, let alone keep them out of trouble. Joe Jackson worked as a crane operator in the steel mills, a job that demanded physical endurance and left little room for softness at home. He had grown up wanting to be a musician himself, boxing a little in his younger years, playing guitar in a rhythm and blues band called the Falcons that never quite broke through to anything resembling real success. By most accounts, that unfinished ambition never fully left him. It sat in the background of everything that came after, a quiet resentment about doors that never opened for him. And when he noticed that his sons could sing, and sing well, something in him shifted permanently. What began as family entertainment, boys harmonizing in the living room after school, turned into rigorous, almost military, rehearsal schedules. Hours after school, hours on weekends, choreography repeated until it was flawless, harmonies drilled until they were seamless enough to compete with professional acts twice their age. To the outside world watching them rise through local talent shows and eventually sign with Motown Records, it looked like extraordinary dedication paying off exactly as it should. A poor black family from the industrial Midwest breaking into the biggest entertainment machine in the country looked, on paper, like the American dream working the way it was supposed to. From the inside, according to the children who actually lived through it, dedication was not really the word that captured what was happening. Fear was the word. Survival was the word. And for one child in particular, the pressure would end up disproportionate to anything his siblings experienced, because that child was about to become the most valuable asset the family had. The most telling detail from those early years is not about singing ability at all. It is about who got permission to sing lead in the first place. Joe Jackson had already decided, before Michael ever opened his mouth in front of him, that Jermaine would be the lead voice of the group. That decision was not based on any careful evaluation of Michael's ability, because Joe had not actually bothered to listen to Michael sing yet. It was based on nothing more than birth order and assumption, the simple fact that Jermaine was older and had therefore been designated the star. It took Michael's mother, Katherine, physically intervening one afternoon after catching her youngest son singing while making his bed, insisting that her husband stop what he was doing and actually listen, before Joe gave the boy any real chance at all. Only after hearing him sing did Joe change his mind, and even then the shift happened almost instantly, as if the previous conviction had never existed. It is a small moment in the grand timeline of the Jackson 5's rise, easy to skip past in a highlight reel. But it says something enormous about the environment Michael grew up in. Even the talent that would eventually make him one of the most famous entertainers who has ever lived had to fight its way past his own father's preconceptions just to be acknowledged in the first place. Recognition in that house was never automatic. It had to be earned, proven, and then proven again. And that pattern of having to fight for basic acknowledgement rather than simply receiving it would go on to define Michael's relationship with his father for the rest of his life, long after the acknowledgement had turned into global adoration from millions of strangers who never had to be convinced. Once Michael became the group's focal point, once audiences and eventually Motown executives started treating him as the obvious center of gravity, the pressure on him did not ease. It intensified, and it intensified specifically because of the position he now occupied. Joe began using Michael as the standard the other brothers were measured against during rehearsals, which sounds almost like a compliment stated plainly, until you understand what enforcement of that standard actually looked like inside the household. Rehearsals were reportedly conducted with Joe seated nearby, often holding a belt, ready to use it the instant a step was missed, a note landed wrong, or timing fell even slightly out of sync. Michael described those years in later interviews not as strict, but ultimately loving parenting, the kind many people look back on with grudging gratitude, but as genuine, physical terror, the kind that made his stomach knot before every single rehearsal began, regardless of how thoroughly he actually knew the material that day. Perfection was not encouraged in that house through praise or patience. It was demanded through consequence, and the gap between demand and delivery was measured directly in physical punishment, sometimes with a belt, sometimes, according to multiple family accounts given independently over the years, with whatever else happened to be within reach in the moment an error occurred. What makes this especially difficult to sit with is the enormous contrast between what television audiences saw and what was happening only hours earlier or later in that same day. A viewer watching the Jackson 5 perform in the early 1970s saw joy, precision, and an almost impossible level of professional polish for children so young, the kind of performance that made industry veterans do a double take. They had no way of knowing that the smiling boy at the center of the formation had likely rehearsed those exact moves that same afternoon, while genuinely afraid of what would happen if his footwork drifted even slightly out of line. As Michael grew older, and became famous enough that journalists finally started asking harder, more direct questions rather than simply celebrating the family's success story. The details became more specific and considerably more disturbing. In interviews conducted years apart, sometimes decades apart, with completely different interviewers who had no coordination with one another, Michael described being struck not only with belts but with cords, extension cords specifically, along with whatever else happened to be within reach at the moment his father's temper broke. He recalled his mother screaming for Joe to stop, warning repeatedly that he was going to kill their child, a specific and chilling phrase that stuck with Michael well into adulthood. He recalled being fast enough as a young boy to outrun his father across the house much of the time, ducking into rooms, hiding behind furniture, buying himself precious seconds, though not always successfully. When he was caught, by his own repeated description across multiple interviews, the punishment that followed was severe enough that he struggled even decades later to discuss it without visible discomfort. What is striking about watching Michael address this on camera? Even as an adult worth hundreds of millions of dollars, one of the single most recognized human beings alive on the entire planet, is how dramatically his body language changed the instant his father's name entered the conversation. He would laugh, but it was not real laughter, more of a reflex than an expression of amusement. He would deflect, joke that Joe might come after him for even discussing the subject publicly, and there was an unmistakable flicker underneath the joke, the same fear that had apparently never fully left him since childhood. Trauma does not check a person's bank balance or their level of global fame before deciding whether it is entitled to resurface. It resurfaces regardless of circumstance, regardless of how far a person has traveled from the room where it originally happened. Michael was not the only sibling to describe this reality, and that matters enormously, because a single account can always be dismissed as exaggeration, memory distortion, or a bid for sympathy. Multiple accounts, given independently across different decades to different interviewers, with no obvious coordination between the siblings, are considerably harder to wave away. His sister LaToya, in interviews and eventually in her own published writing, painted an even starker picture of life inside that house, describing beatings that extended beyond just Michael to nearly all of the children at one point or another, describing her own brothers as grown men, some of them already fathers themselves with children in college, who remained visibly uneasy around their own father decades after leaving home. She went further still, alleging that Joe's physical aggression extended toward Katherine as well, something Michael reportedly told her he had witnessed directly himself, even though LaToya said she personally had never seen that particular form of violence firsthand. Whether every single detail lines up with perfect precision across every sibling account is almost beside the larger point being made here. What lines up consistently across multiple family members speaking in different years to different journalists with different motivations is the general shape of the story being told. A household ruled substantially by fear. Discipline that regularly crossed the line into what most reasonable observers today would call abuse. And extraordinary success that came at a steep, largely hidden cost that the public would not fully understand for years, if ever. Not every member of the family told this story the same way, and that divide is genuinely worth sitting with rather than smoothing over for the sake of a tidy narrative, because it reveals something true and complicated about how families process shared trauma differently depending on where each person stood within it. Tito Jackson, when asked directly and repeatedly about his father's parenting style over the years, consistently defended Joe, describing him as strict but fundamentally well-intentioned. A man who pushed his children hard specifically because he wanted them to succeed in an industry and a country that offered vanishingly few second chances to black families coming out of Gary, Indiana, in that particular era. Tito has said publicly, on more than one occasion, that he holds no resentment toward his father, that he understood even while the discipline was actively happening that it came from a place of ambition and protective instinct rather than simple cruelty for its own sake. There is something worth taking seriously in that perspective, and it would be dishonest to simply discard it in favor of a cleaner villain narrative. Context genuinely matters here. The pressures facing a black working-class family attempting to break into an entertainment industry that had systematically shut out so many talented people before them were real, severe, and not easily understood from a comfortable modern distance. But even within Tito's consistent defense of his father, cracks appeared whenever the conversation turned specifically to Michael. Tito acknowledged, almost as an aside during one particular interview, that Michael in particular never got to experience anything resembling a normal childhood, that the intensity of demands placed specifically on Michael, as the group's clear breakout star and eventual chief financial engine, exceeded what the other siblings experienced even within an already demanding household. He connected Michael's well-documented, lifelong fascination with childhood itself, the amusement park rides installed at his own home, the fixation on Peter Pan and stories about boys who never had to grow up, the deep desire to surround himself with children and give them the kind of unstructured joy he felt he had personally missed, directly back to what had been taken from him during those early years. That is not a small admission coming from a brother who spent most of his public life defending their father. It is, in effect, family confirmation of the very wound Michael spent his adult life trying to describe publicly and, in his own strange and at times deeply troubling way, trying to heal by recreating for other children the childhood he never got to have himself. This divide between siblings, between defending Joe as a flawed but ultimately well-meaning product of his own difficult circumstances and condemning him as someone who caused genuine, lasting harm to his own children, becomes almost impossible to hold onto comfortably once you watch how Joe himself responded when he was finally directly confronted with the specifics. In multiple television interviews, including one particularly tense and widely circulated exchange years after Michael had already spoken publicly and repeatedly about being beaten as a child, Joe categorically denied that any physical abuse had ever taken place. He insisted he had raised his children exactly the same way any responsible parent of that era would have, that accusations of abuse were essentially fabrications manufactured and spread by tabloid media eager for a sensational story. And at one striking point he invoked the historical brutality inflicted on enslaved people generations earlier as a sweeping, somewhat startling justification for corporal punishment within black households more broadly. He argued further that a large number of American parents spanked their children regardless of what they publicly admitted, and that anyone claiming they never did was simply not being honest. What made this particular denial especially jarring for longtime viewers who had followed the family story for decades was the specific timeline involved. This was not a man vaguely denying rumors circulating in the press. This was a man directly denying specific, detailed accounts his own son had already given on camera years earlier, describing fear, extension cords, belts, and a mother screaming that her husband was going to kill their child. The gap between Michael's stated memory and Joe's public account was not really a matter of differing interpretation or fading recollection. It was a flat, direct contradiction, and it left a great many longtime fans with a deeply uncomfortable sense that even after Michael's death in 2009, his own father was still unwilling to let him fully own his experience of his own childhood, still fighting to control the narrative even when the person at the center of it could no longer speak for himself. Perhaps nothing captures the final settled state of that relationship better than a single quiet moment that took place long after the Jackson Five had dissolved into memory and Michael had become one of the most powerful and self-sufficient entertainers on earth. Joe arrived one day at Michael's home in Las Vegas, expecting, as he apparently always had throughout their entire relationship, immediate and unquestioned access to his son. Word came back through a member of Michael's household staff that Joe would need to make an appointment first, the same as anyone else on Michael's tightly managed weekly schedule. Joe reportedly did not take that news well at all. He reacted with visible anger, reminding whoever would listen that without him, none of his children would ever have had careers in the first place, that he was the one who had built the entire foundation everything else in their lives now stood on. In a narrow, technical sense, that particular claim was not wrong. Joe Jackson's relentless ambition, iron discipline, and constant pushing genuinely did create the conditions for one of the most extraordinary rises in the history of popular music, a rise that changed the culture and made an entire family wealthy beyond anything they could have imagined in Gary, Indiana. But ambition and harm are not mutually exclusive, and the simple, almost bureaucratic appointment request said something that no lengthy interview ever fully managed to capture in words. It said that the boy who once could not always outrun his father fast enough through the halls of their own house had grown into a man who, even at the absolute height of his own power and global fame, still needed distance, structure, and formal control over how much access that same father was allowed to have to his life. Joe remembered building an empire, and in his own mind, that memory was not wrong. Michael remembered surviving one, and in his own mind, that memory was not wrong either. Both of those things were simultaneously true, inside the very same family, under the very same roof, and that uncomfortable duality is precisely what makes this story so difficult to look away from even now, more than 15 years after Michael's death. It is not a simple tale of a monster and his helpless victim, a story that would be easy to package and easy to forget. It is a far more familiar and far more unsettling story about ambition curdling slowly into control, about love and fear becoming so tightly tangled together within one family that even the people who lived through it firsthand struggled, for the rest of their lives, to fully pull the two apart from one another, let alone explain the difference to anyone standing safely on the outside looking in. There is another figure in this story who rarely gets examined with the same intensity as Joe, and that is Katherine Jackson, Michael's mother, whose role in all of this was quieter, but no less significant. By multiple accounts, including Michael's own, Katherine was the one steady source of warmth in an otherwise rigid household, the parent who intervened to get him his shot at lead vocals, the one whose screams are remembered echoing through the house during the worst of the punishments, pleading with Joe to stop before real harm was done. And yet she stayed. She raised 9 children inside a home she reportedly knew was unsafe for at least some of them. and she never left, a fact that both Michael and LaToya have addressed with visible pain and complicated loyalty rather than simple anger. Katherine's own religious devotion. She raised the children as Jehovah's Witnesses, shaped much of the household's moral framework, and by several accounts, she believed firmly in staying together as a family unit no matter the cost, a belief common to her generation and her faith, but one that, in hindsight, left her children exposed to a father whose temper she could soften in individual moments, but never fully contain. This is not a detail included to shift blame away from Joe onto Katherine instead. It is included because family harm rarely comes from a single source acting alone. It comes from systems, from silence, from a household culture where everyone involved, including the parent trying hardest to protect the children, still could not or did not stop what was happening. That is a harder truth than simply naming one villain, and it is closer to how these situations actually unfold in real families, famous or otherwise. It is also worth placing this story inside the broader cultural context of the era rather than judging it purely by today's standards, without using that context as an excuse. Corporal punishment was widely practiced across American households in the 1960s and 70s, across racial and economic lines. And for many black families specifically, strict discipline was frequently framed, including by Joe himself in later interviews, as a form of protection in a world that offered black children very little margin for error or forgiveness. That framing is not without historical logic. Children who stepped out of line in certain environments faced consequences far beyond a stern parent, consequences involving police, involving a justice system with a long and documented history of treating black youth with disproportionate severity. Joe's generation had watched relatives and neighbors pulled into that system, sometimes for far less than what would get a white child warning. Seen through that lens, an argument can be made that Joe's severity came from genuine fear for his children's survival in a hostile world, not simply a desire for control or a projection of his own unfulfilled ambitions onto them. But that context, however real, does not erase what Michael specifically described, because the discipline Michael detailed went well beyond ordinary corporal punishment, even by the more permissive standards of that time. Extension cords, ironing cords, punches, being thrown against walls hard enough to leave lasting fear decades later, a mother screaming that her husband was going to kill their child. These are not standard descriptions of a strict but loving household from any era. Context can explain a culture. It cannot fully explain away specific, repeated, escalating violence against a child too young and too small to defend himself, no matter how successful that child eventually became as a direct result of the pressure applied to him. The years after Michael's own rise to solo superstardom only deepened the strangeness of his relationship with his father, because success did not resolve the underlying dynamic. It simply gave Michael more resources to manage it from a distance. As his fame grew through Off the Wall, and then Thriller, the best-selling album in history, Joe remained present at award shows, present in business discussions, still functioning for years as a manager of sorts even after Michael had technically taken control of his own career. Michael rarely cut his father out entirely, and that detail matters because it complicates any simple story of a son who simply walked away from an abusive parent. Instead, what emerges is something messier and more human, a son who kept his father at a carefully managed distance rather than a complete one, who allowed him into business matters while restricting personal access, who by his own description still flinched at the idea of openly criticizing Joe on camera, even as an adult worth a fortune Joe himself had helped build. That contradiction, wanting distance while never fully closing the door, is one of the clearest signs of how deep the entanglement between fear and love actually ran in that relationship. Children who are abused by a parent rarely experience pure hatred toward that parent. What they far more often experience is exactly what Michael appeared to live with for decades, a tangled, unresolved mixture of resentment, longing, obligation, and a persistent, almost involuntary hope that the approval withheld in childhood might still eventually arrive, if he just kept succeeding at a high enough level. Michael's own approach to fatherhood later in life offers one final, quiet piece of evidence about how deeply this childhood shaped him. Those who spent time around his own 3 children consistently described a parenting style that was, in almost every visible way, the direct inverse of what Joe had practiced. Michael was reportedly gentle to the point of being overly permissive, deeply reluctant to raise his voice, and almost obsessively protective of his children's privacy and freedom to simply be children, sometimes to a degree that drew its own separate criticism from observers who felt he swung too far in the opposite direction. Whatever one makes of the specific choices he made as a parent, some of which remain genuinely controversial, the underlying instinct behind them is not difficult to trace back to its source. A man who had been pushed, struck, and rehearsed into perfection as a child built, quite deliberately, a home for his own children where none of that would be allowed to happen again. It is one of the more quietly tragic details of the entire story that Michael Jackson, one of the most scrutinized human beings of the 20th century, spent his adult life trying to build for his own children the ordinary, unremarkable childhood that his own extraordinary talent had made impossible for him to ever have. What remains in the end is not a verdict. It is a set of facts that refuse to resolve into something simpler than they actually are. A father who built something extraordinary out of 5 sons and genuinely believed, right up until his own death in 2018, that he had done nothing wrong in the process. A son who spent 40 years trying to reconcile global adoration with a private terror that never fully released its grip, who built an entire fantasy world at Neverland partly as an attempt to hand other children the freedom he never got to have himself. Siblings who lived through the exact same house and walked away with genuinely different conclusions about what it meant, some choosing gratitude, some choosing condemnation, most choosing something more complicated than either word can really hold. There is no tidy ending here, no moment of full reconciliation captured on camera. No clean apology that settles the record for good. What there is instead is a pattern that repeats far more often than most people realize, in far less famous families, in houses with no cameras, and no talk show appearances to preserve the record. A parent convinced that pushing hard enough is the same thing as loving well. A child who becomes extraordinary precisely because of that pushing, and who spends the rest of their life quietly working out what it cost them to get there. Michael Jackson turned that cost into music, into performance, into a childhood he tried endlessly to rebuild for himself in adulthood, and into interviews where, decades after the belt and the chords and the rehearsals filled with fear, he still could not quite bring himself to fully condemn the man responsible, still reaching, even then, for some version of his father's approval that never fully arrived.